Okay, so let me introduce you to Dolores, if that's okay. And thank you
Grant.
so much for coming along. And thanks to those of you who are here and who might be watching it later through the video. So we have Dolores McManus with us today. She is an academic developer in the Learning, Teaching and Assessment team. And Dolores has been in DIT/TU Dublin since 2002, and her focus includes active learning strategies, student engagement, e-portfolios, and formative assessment. And today, Dolores is going to take us through some practical approaches to increase student attendance and engagement. So thank you so much, Dolores. I'll hand over to you.
Thanks a million, Roisin. That's great. And thank you very much for having me along here today. As Roisin said, I've been in TU Dublin/DIT a very long time, and I might have come across some of you previously working as a digital skills coach or working in Brightspace support. They were my two main areas before I moved into the academic developer role about 2-3 years ago. Okay, so today we only have 40 minutes. So I'm going to go through some things very speedily, but there are lots of resources and links available to you. So anything that's mentioned here, you will find additional information about it if you follow any of the links. Feel free to throw questions into the chat if you have any questions as we're going along. And we'll also be doing a small little bit of interaction as we're going through the session as well, just seeing as it is about engagement and promoting that student attendance piece. And the evidence that we have points to active learning and engagement really driving up student attendance and achievement. Okay, so to get going, if I could get my mouse to work, what we're looking at today is really just what do we mean by engagement, what do we mean by active learning, and what evidence is there to support the statement that active learning contributes to engagement. We'll also be looking at a number of active learning strategies, but we'll be looking at those very speedily. But again, if there's anything there that particularly catches your eye and you've got a question about it, please stop me at any point too. We'll be talking about some general principles that apply to all active learning. So really just some little preparatory pieces of work that you will need to do when you're getting ready to introduce some active learning strategies to your students. We're going to look at one specific strategy which may benefit attendance. We'll look at that towards the end, and it is building on the use of the Brightspace quiz tool, Brightspace Intelligent Agents, and some of the settings that you can use within Brightspace to kind of nudge your students towards attendance. And then we'll just have a little look at what you might take away from this session as well, what your next steps ideally should be. So at the end of the session, hopefully you'll be able to describe how active learning can impact student engagement. You will be able to articulate the general steps needed for successful implementation. You will have an ability to discuss competently a number of active learning strategies and know where to go to find out how to implement those strategies, or know where to go to get further information about them. And you will be in a position, if you wish, to implement one defined strategy designed to enhance student attendance. All right, so just to kick off to begin with, I'm going to ask, I know there aren't very many of us here, so we'll just do this very quickly. If you have your mobile phone available to you, you can point your camera at the QR code there, and it'll bring you into a quick little VBox poll where we're going to ask, how do you know that your students are engaged? So what are the signs to you when you're in a class with your students, whether it be online or face-to-face? How do you know that they are with you and that they're engaged, they're interested in their content, and that they're, you know, that they're alive to what's going on in the classroom? So I'll just give you a minute or two to pop into that VBox poll. And you can also, if you prefer, you can just open up a second browser window on your laptop, go to vbox.app and type in that ID 192015029. Okay, so I can see that 2 of you are in there. So I will give it another 10, 20 seconds or so. So now I've switched away from PowerPoint and I'm in VBox. So that's what we're looking at here is the VBox screen. And up here on the right hand side, I can see that 3 of you are in this VBox poll and that 2 of you have submitted a response. So I'm just going to hit show results. So just to get a sense of how this works as well. Okay, thanks very much. That they try any classwork that they are asked to do. That's a very good point. Absolutely. You know, I think we can't take it for granted. Now, and I wonder actually, when you say any classwork that they are asked to do, are you talking about classwork that you have given them in advance of the lecture, or classwork that you have given them during the lecture? Because I think that's an interesting point. Because sometimes I've noticed in class observations, it's not necessarily the case that when you ask students to do something during a session that they will actually do it. So whoever put that in, do you have anything to say about that? Hi, Denise.
Hi, it was me. I have a large group with first year science, and I generally do find that there's maybe a little bit of I'm maths is my subject, that there's a bit of competition nearly between them. That if I have just put a few questions, like I'll deliver the material and then they have in-class questions for them to do. And if I look, I would say about 95% of a group of 80 would be engaged because there's a little bit of rivalry. Now, I am quite, hopefully they're not all on phones and stuff like that, but I would say there's a good engagement in that respect because there's a good feel in the class. I don't know how to describe that. You know what I mean? Yeah.
I do know, but I mean, I think we all know what you mean about that good feel. You can tell when you do get a positive sense, and it gives you energy as well,
Exactly, yeah.
So that's really nice. And we'll talk a little bit about that kind of in-class work later on, and I'll be interested to hear your perspective on whether it's better for students to do that individually or whether there might be a benefit to students working in groups and then responding. And can I ask, how do you get those responses from your students? How do they feed their answer back to you?
Generally, I do sometimes ask, does anybody want to come down to the board to do a question? But obviously I don't force that because you can't do that. And sometimes they do because I think they like a little bit to show off. Generally then it's just a case I'll put up the solutions and I'll say, there's the answers, just go through the steps. If you made a mistake, don't rub it out, just highlight what your mistake was and just try not to do it again,
Yeah, great, excellent. Okay, that sounds really good. Now, hold on, where's my presentation gone to? Okay, that's great because, it is brilliant to hear about what people are doing. All right, so we these are responses we were given previously when I asked similar questions. How do you know that your students are engaged? And it's quite similar ideas: asking questions, getting review questions right, answering your questions and asking questions. And I really like the eye contact piece as well. And the responding with nods that you mentioned today, because I do think that's valuable. Students just indicating to you that they're actively listening, and a very simple way of gauging if they're actively listening is that eye contact and nodding piece. In terms of what the hallmarks of engagement are, there are a number of models out there which we in the LTA would follow, and this one in particular is drawn from Boden's model of engagement, and he looks at it from a number of different dimensions. Talks about behavioural engagement, which is typically that attending class piece and being an active participant when you're there, attentiveness, that piece that we were all just talking about. And the cognitive engagement piece as well is really interesting. And this is something kind of to be aware of, particularly in terms of, and I know this is something that as a lecturer we would all try to do automatically anyway, but ensuring that the material being presented to students is neither too difficult nor too easy, so that there is that you're kind of at that sweet spot in terms of the challenge that students are being presented with. And emotional engagement is, a lot of the research is showing it's increasingly important, this whole kind of the sense of belonging, And that builds out of the social engagement which comes from interacting with their peers. And that's partly why I was asking Denise there about whether you get your students to work in groups or individually, because I think anything we can do that encourages students just to engage with one another, it helps build that kind of the social engagement piece, and it helps to build that sense of belonging, all of which are identified in the research as being hallmarks of engagement. Okay. And I suppose the other thing as well, you know, the students have a responsibility in this. They are adults. You can't force them to engage, but what you try to do is to create the conditions where your students will see and feel the benefits of engagement. And the active learning strategies that we'll be looking at shortly, they all have an implicit relationship to one or more of the characteristics set out here. And I would say as well, this list, it's not an exhaustive list by any stretch of the imagination. There are other markers of engagement, but this is just, I think it's enough to be going on with. Again, Boden's model. I'm just picking out these two kind of qualities on the right-hand side: self-efficacy and a sense of belonging. As I mentioned, the research is increasingly showing that belonging is, and that emotional safety that students feel is increasingly important to the level at which they participate and engage in their university life, be that the academic life or the social, the extracurricular piece. Self-efficacy is really, defining self-efficacy, it's the belief that you can successfully carry out the tasks and behaviours necessary to reach a particular level of academic achievement. So really having a sense that the effort you're putting in is going to help you achieve the learning goals for the programme. And one way, again, research is coming out very strongly to support the idea that students need to have that belief in their ability to succeed at the program of study they've taken on. And you can help them develop this concept and develop the actual underlying skills and knowledge that they need to fulfill their belief but if early on, particularly when you start using active learning strategies in the classroom, if you can give them the experience of early success, so that perhaps when you're designing some active learning strategies and building them into your lectures, remember that early success piece. You want your students to feel good about what they're doing and to feel a sense of achievement over what they're doing in class with you. Okay, so again, these are just a couple of more kind of characterizations of what student engagement can mean. But where does this leave us in terms of active learning? We have a good sense and lots of evidence to point that engagement is very important for student achievement. And student achievement, of course, means students meet their learning outcomes on a year-by-year basis. They progress and they eventually graduate. And for TU Dublin at the moment in particular, that retention piece is incredibly important. But how do we achieve the sort of levels of engagement we would like to see? We do that, in part at least, by active learning. And again, there's plenty of data and research to back that up. So we'll just talk a little bit about what active learning is. And there are many, many definitions out there. And you can see active learning is about teachers providing the environment and opportunities for students to build knowledge and understanding of a subject for themselves. To learn well and deeply, students need to be active participants in that process, doing something. And I think that really is the key piece: doing something, thinking, reading, discussing, problem solving, reflecting. And basically, it's an umbrella term for the use of any strategy that encourages your students to actively engage with learning. And the result really is, particularly in the lecture environment, the experience should be that you are doing less and that the students are doing more. So there is, we'll talk about this later on as well, there is a requirement to create a little bit of space in your lecture for active learning, and you'll do that through some careful lesson planning and perhaps by looking at how you might give content to your students in advance of classes or alternatively after class via the VLE, etc. But there is, I suppose, a need to create that space in your lecture for active learning. Okay, so active learning engagement, you can have a look at the data that is there, the research that is there to support it. And what is active learning? Like, I'm sure you're probably well aware of some of these terms, you know, think, pair, share, peer review, case studies. Maybe things like role playing and jigsaw discussion might be new to you, experiential learning, etc. But there is a continuum of active learning as well, going from the simple to the very complex, and also going from strategies that you can use with your students, where your students engage with them on an individual basis, and some strategies where your students are working together. And I would actually, personally, I think that if you are going to take the time out of your lecture for active learning, that giving students the opportunity to collaborate with their peers and to build up relationships with their peers, it's a double win, really. So I really like active learning strategies which are collaborative by nature. Okay, and so strategies, and again, I am going to go through these very, very, very quickly, but questioning, something that probably everybody is doing, think, pair, share, concept mapping, gallery walk, where students set themselves up to kind of teach other people in their class and kind of display their perspective on a particular issue, minute paper, jigsaw discussion, flipped classroom, problem solving, case studies, and playful learning, which actually is my colleague Edel Gallagher is particularly interested in that, and is a really good person to speak to about bringing that kind of sense of fun and joy into a class, which I think, you know, it's a very nice thing to do if you can achieve it. So strategy one, questioning, and I would think most of you are probably familiar with questioning, and most of you probably are already doing this. The key message here is to have some questions prepared in advance. And when you throw a question out to your students, consider maybe giving them a minute or two to consider the question and then come back to them for a response. So that is just if you're asking questions, just throwing them out verbally to students in the class, give them a second or two, and that would hopefully means that, you know, typically lecturers will say that it's the same handful of people who respond to questions on an ongoing basis. So if you give students a little bit of space to gather their thoughts, perhaps you might hear from other students in the class as well. And really, there's lots of information there about questioning types. And I would say, thinking, you know, particularly at the start, thinking about creating a safe space, somewhere where your students are comfortable speaking up. So to do that, I would, particularly at the beginning, I would make it as easy as possible for students to engage. And so at the start, when you're getting students used to participating in lectures and used to speaking up in class, make the questions easy, you know, or ask them nice open questions that most students in the class might be expected to have a position or an opinion on. So there's some nice questions there about kind of, you know, the questions about divergent thinking here, and questions that shape understanding. The classifications here are good and well worth having a little read through after the session. Again, VVox, which you may or may not be familiar with, but an awful lot of lecturers across the university are using it in different ways. So they're using it for comprehension checking. So just to make sure that the students are still with you, or that they're getting a particular concept. And it's particularly good because VVox polls are anonymous. So where a student might not be willing to stand up in front of the class and say, I really have no idea what's going on, they may well be willing to indicate their confusion in response to a quiz question, or you'll know if they get the question wrong, they're just not getting it, but they won't be so worried about letting you know via Vevox that they're not getting it, because that is anonymous. And I also think it's really important to acknowledge and to review and to discuss the responses that come in via Vevox, even if it is for comprehension checking. And I would also recommend using Vevox as a stepping stone to classroom discussion, because where you might have students who aren't comfortable speaking up and who then you use a Vevox poll, they use their phones, they submit a response to you. When students see a number of responses on screen and maybe see their own response on screen, they may be more willing to follow that up with a little bit of discussion. So I would always use Vevox as a kind of a jumping off point rather than an end in itself. Okay, and one thing to highlight about Vevox is that there is a Q&A tool in it as well. So students can ask questions using that Q&A tool, which can be moderated or totally moderated by you yourself. So you have control over what the students ask, and also students will be able to see questions posed by others in the class and can vote or like those questions. So it gives you a sense of kind of what are the common questions coming through. All right, so I'm going to think, pair, share. I am going to let you read through a number of these yourselves because I'm conscious of time. It's coming up to 20 to 2. So stop me if there's anything in particular that you want to me to dwell on. But other than that, I'm just going to fly through these strategies, and then you can also catch up on these on the recording from the previous session that I delivered. So think, write, share, very similar to think, pair, share, just means that you're giving students a little bit of time to gather their thoughts properly and to write those down rather than just thinking about it, which can really help some students, gives them a bit of confidence then when they go into groups to share their ideas. A lot of this is about confidence building. Concept maps and mind maps, I think, are fantastic ways of getting students to consolidate their learning. So if you ask students to consider drawing a concept map at the end of a lecture, detailing out the key points that were covered in that lecture, I think it's a way of stimulates a little bit of deeper thinking, and it's also helpful for students who might be more visual as well. Like, you know, they get their ideas down in a more visual manner. And again, it fosters good communication and collaboration. Those are really important skills. A few examples there are some nice concept maps and some tools you might think about. Gallery walk really is about students kind of, I suppose, posting and defending and discussing their ideas. And again, because it's a small group situation, it's probably less intimidating to speak up in that small group rather than doing it in front of the entire class. But because it's a gallery walk and you move from station to station, you will interact with more people and interact with more ideas than just working in a small group as you would with think, pair, share. And while gallery walk, it kind of lends itself to nice, big, open, flat classrooms, which we're not always teaching in those. You can also adapt it to an online version and get students working in collaborative documents and then sharing those documents afterwards. Minute paper and Muddiest Point, I think, is a really useful one. It's a pause to give people the opportunity to consolidate their learning. Basically, just to have a think about what has been presented to them so far, and to write down what's important to them at that point, and maybe to consider one or two questions that they may have. And I've included an example of a really quick minute paper at the end of the slides, which you might like to complete yourself at the end of this session as well. And Jigsaw is very nice. There's a very good video there which will talk you through it, and I'll pause that. Really, it is about peer teaching. So students becoming familiar with one part of a topic and then teaching that little piece of the topic to other students in the class. And it kind of works in a round robin fashion, and students again move from group to group. But there is one caveat with it, that obviously you don't want your students teaching incorrect material to each other. So you as lecturer need to be quite involved with kind of ensuring that the material that the students, that the interpretation that the particular student has taken is the correct one. So it does involve the lecturer interacting with groups quite carefully as well, but it's a very nice method. Flipped classroom, particularly if you have a lot of content and you want to take some of the content out of the lecture, the flipped classroom approach is the way to do it, because it really means encouraging your students to do pre-lecture reading or watching or viewing. But it's very important that students are given really clear guidelines about what it is that they're expected to do in advance of your lecture. What content specifically are they expected to engage with? So there's some kind of examples there about the types of instructions that you might give to your students in that case. And again, there's the fail, flip, fix, feed model is worth looking up. Really, it just means that your students are given an opportunity to carry out a piece of work without all of the support and knowledge. So that primes them to identify the information skills that they're missing and to zone in on those as they go through their learning process. And problem solving, I would think, Denise, you were talking about this earlier on. And again, it is a great strategy to give problems out to students and allow them to work through those problems and to feed that back to you. And again, I think there is a benefit to students working in small pairs or groups on this, particularly if the material is more challenging. It can. I've been in lectures where students are given problems and you can see that they're overwhelmed by the problems. So you want to avoid that situation. And one way of avoiding that while still giving out challenging work is to put students into groups where they can work together. And again, case studies very similar to kind of problem-based, it's problem, you give the students a problem and they are a scenario and they explore their reaction to it. Playful learning, I am just going to leave as is and leave some nice links that you can follow up there, because it's not one that I am overly familiar with myself. All right, and then really these guidelines, purposeful and planned lesson planning. For successful active learning, you really do need to plan it in advance. So you need to go back to basics in terms of lesson planning. Know what you're going to do, when you're going to do it, and why you're going to do it. So again, directly related to the content you're teaching, it has to be meaningful to the students. There's no point just throwing up a VBox poll for fun, although sometimes as an icebreaker, that's absolutely fine. But it should have a purpose and be related to the material you're teaching. Time limited and have a deliverable. These are really important. So I think if you think of yourself at a conference or an event and you're told to go into a breakout room for a little while, the first thing that anybody says is, what are we supposed to be doing? So make sure that your students know what it is that you're asking them to do, so that there is a deliverable, that they have to give an answer to a maths question. They have to be able to describe a scenario. they have to come up with a new model for something. Whatever that deliverable is, make it explicit and make sure that the students, know what it is and they know how long they have to do it. And don't overuse any one method, because they can, what seems very novel initially can quickly become quite, people can get overexposed to it. And I would say, again, going back to that idea, you will need to create space in your lecture to facilitate active learning. And one way to, if you haven't been lesson planning in a while, you may just, this is quite a nice little model where you do your introduction, you set out the key learnings for the session. You provide a mini lecture, absolutely, I would say max 15 minutes of presentation where you go through the content, and you can certainly take questions and answers through that as well, but then take a break for some sort of interactive, collaborative activity, return back to your content, perhaps take another break for an activity, and then do a wrap up where you go back over exactly what it is you were hoping for the students to get out of this session. And again, in terms of creating that space, the flipped classroom approach, if you have an awful lot of content to go through with your students, you might consider taking some of that content out of the lecture to make space for collaborative and active learning. Right, so this is the minute paper, which I'm not going to ask you to do now, but you might consider having a look at it in your own time after this session if you have a couple of minutes. And now what I want to turn to, and so there's some resources there, I want to turn to the whole idea of attendance, which myself and Roisin were talking about yesterday. And this screenshot here is from an Australian lecturer who was faced with completely empty classrooms on a number of occasions immediately after COVID. And he posted that on Twitter and it went viral. But I don't think we're at this point any longer, but certainly there is an indication out there that students are not turning up in the numbers that we would like to see. So one strategy which you may wish to consider would be kind of, without formally taking an attendance report each week, you could harness the power of Brightspace to deliver a very short quiz, maybe at the start or during the middle of your lecture. It could be any piece of active learning. It could be, you might ask the students to respond to an open-ended question within the quiz tool. So it doesn't have to be a difficult, tough, summative quiz. You can use the Brightspace quiz tool in a variety of different ways, but you take a couple of minutes to get the students in the class to complete a short weekly or quarterly in-class quiz. And ideally, I think, again, because you want the maximum number of students to participate in this and to submit answers, I think it would be best if students work in small groups and they can agree their responses to the quiz questions. And when your students submit that through Brightspace, you will then have a de facto record of attendance, which you can review fairly easily on an ongoing basis. But further to that, you can also use the Brightspace Intelligence Agent to draft and to send what looks like and feels like to the student like a personalized email from you, indicating that you weren't in class with us recently, just checking in with you. You can draft a very kind of friendly and gentle email, and the Brightspace Intelligent Agent will check the list of students who participated in the quiz and will email those students who weren't or who haven't submitted to the quiz. There are a couple of steps involved in setting that up, but it's quite straightforward and it's not particularly arduous. And just to give you a sense of, this is kind of a test, one that I set up yesterday evening. You can see on the left-hand side a very gentle email to a student just saying, you know, I've noticed that you weren't in class to take this quiz. I've made the quiz available to you now if you'd like to take it, so that you know what we're working on currently. And it's just an idea of kind of nudging your students really to participate. And then more practically, you can also then get an Excel spreadsheet, which this is an export from the Brightspace Grades tool, which will list all of the students who are enrolled on that Brightspace module. And you will be able to see, by virtue of whether they do or don't have a result in the quiz column, whether they were in attendance on that particular day or not. And it's not challenging to set up simple quizzes in Brightspace, and it's definitely not challenging to set up the intelligent agent. So it's just something that perhaps you might have a think about. And if you are interested in that, I'd certainly love to hear more from you. So I'm going to leave it there because it's 13:52 and I haven't given people a chance to or to discuss anything. So Roisin, any questions that I missed or any questions that anyone has?
There's nothing in the chat at the minute, but maybe we'll just give people a few minutes.
Okay.
I think this is heading off. She said, I keep asking myself how to effectively implement these strategies. How can we address the needs of students who may not respond to questions due to shyness or reluctance to speak in public, particularly in a large class setting with around 170 students? Any suggestions on that, Dolores?
Yeah, I mean, this does come up, and it kind of goes back to that whole start small piece as far as possible. Students, lots of students are shy. I wouldn't particularly like to put up my hand in a group of 170 people and expose myself to the entire class. In that case, I would definitely start using Vivox in that classroom, which at least gives people the opportunity to ask questions. If they've got a question and they're too shy to ask it out loud live in the class, that Vivox Q&A functionality is really good for gathering those questions from shyer students. And then I would also go back to basics and start with some small strategies like think, pair, share. And I know in very large classes, it's, you know, they're not going to be able to gather around tables or anything like that, but they can pair up and talk to whoever they're sitting beside. And in that way, you know, they get a little bit of confidence just from having 2 or 3 people agreeing on a response. So I definitely would try and implement some think, pair, share and group work in the classroom and some Vivox as well.
There's a comment in there from Denise, which is fair enough. She's very supportive of giving students space for active learning in class, but you also have to be very careful that you don't give them too much space, because there can be a tendency to disengage. So it's the balance really between the two things, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I would agree with that. And it kind of, that goes back to the whole idea of just lesson planning. And your lesson plan doesn't have to be terribly formal. It can just be written down briefly on a piece of paper, but knowing what you're going to do. So it helps you kind of keep control of that as well. And you're absolutely right, Denise.
Can I just ask, I'm really excited to hear about this intelligent agents element and the quizzes in Brightspace. I'm a Moodler, if there is such a thing. So since the move to Brightspace, I haven't actually been using it. So this is really new to me. I'm just wondering, if people want to find out more about how to do this, where can they go?
In the first instance, if they want to do that, they can come back to me, because I think I would be very happy to facilitate a session talking people through the steps they need to do to get this set up. And I would probably bring in colleagues from Brightspace as well to give some support on that. But in the first instance, for the moment, if they come back to me, I'd be quite happy to follow up on this.
Yeah, that'd be brilliant. And I see you had there just the, you know, if anyone wants to do a pilot, I'd be happy to help with that as well. I know anecdotally from speaking to people, and just, you know, on campuses that attendance is low at the minute. And, you know, if you have really low attendance at the minute and you want to try something like this for a few weeks and see, if it improves, and just keep a record of the numbers and the improvement, and feed that back. I'd be delighted to be on board with that, and it'd be something you could bring to the showcase at the end of the year in June as well. Something we'd really like to hear about and see, is it working, you know, when you bring it into play in the classroom. So please reach out if you're interested in that as well.
Okay, brilliant.
Okay,
Thank
so
you
I
very
don't think
much.
there's any other questions. So thank you so much, Dolores. That was an absolutely brilliant set of information for everyone. The comments in the chat are reiterating that as well. It's fantastic to have the video that I can share with everyone too. And just before you go, Dolores, is there any LTA events coming up that you want to highlight in the next few weeks? That people separate to this is the lunchtime learning session for Faculty of Computing, Digital and Data, but the LTA run their own as well, don't they?
We do, absolutely. And we have some very nice ones. We have a Cup of Teaching, which you might have seen advertised recently. So we're on campus going, I think on Monday, we are in Central Quad in Grangegorman from 10 to 12, really just doing a little bit of a tour around all of the campuses to say hello to people. So if you're around, please do come along for a cup of tea and a bit of chat generally about teaching. So 10 to 12 in Central Quad. And we will be there with our posters. We have some very good workshops coming up. 1 hour sessions, Introduction to Universal Design for Learning Guidelines. That's a really excellent session. So if you have any concerns about accessibility in particular, that's a worthwhile session. Humanistic Theories of Learning is really all about it supports the development of rapport, and it focuses on the relationship that we build up with our students and how best to support students, but from an academic perspective. It's not the pastoral care piece. We also have a range of CPD programs, which looking at, we have a 5 ECTS CPD on Universal Design for Learning. We also have a 5 ECTS CPD on supervising undergraduate student dissertations and projects. That's starting on the 18th of March. And we also have a session on creativity, or a CPD on creativity and critical thinking coming up shortly. But you'll find all of those in our calendar of events. So if you just follow through to the Academic Affairs calendar of events, you'll get lots more information on all of this.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Dolores. And thanks to everyone for coming along today. Much appreciated.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks everyone. Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.